Good evening. I'm Harold Holzer, and on behalf of Jennifer Rabb, the president of Hunter College, I'm honored to welcome all of you to Roosevelt House, Hunter's Public Policy Institute, and of course, the townhouse where Eleanor and Franklin Roosevelt lived for the 25 years leading up to his inauguration as president in 1933. It's wonderful to welcome all of you in person, particularly wonderful to welcome a hero of Roosevelt House, one of our founding Board of Advisors members, the former Lieutenant Governor of New York, Richard Ravitch. So as we near the 90th anniversary of the election that sent FDR from this house to the White House, and the 90th anniversary of the first 100 days that one of our guests tonight has written about so definitively, what more appropriate place to house another important Roosevelt book? What is more appropriate a venue than 47-49 East 65th Street? And Jonathan Darmon's new book, Becoming FDR, examines one of the most fraught periods of their residence here, the personal crisis that made FDR president, his struggle with polio, and how that fight forged his character and made possible his political rise. As most audience members who've been here often know, this is the place where it happened. These are the rooms where it happened. This is where FDR worked to regain his physical health and his self-confidence. This is the house that boasted an unusual feature, an elevator, that enabled him to have a degree of mobility in his wheelchair. This is the place where he walked from his library to his upstairs parlor on crutches, supported by his son, to practice the walk that he would conduct at the 1924 Democratic Convention, signaling his comeback from infirmity back into national politics. Anyway, you also know he ran for governor twice here. He gave his first fireside chat here, although it wasn't counted. He organized the New Deal here, not to get ahead of ourselves. But without this house, its access to medical care, to expert doctors, the tireless work of Eleanor as a nurse, a rather unsung aspect of her life, and FDR's own indomitability, we don't know how the future would have turned out. Anyway, that's my report on why this is such an honor for us to introduce this book here and to welcome two Jonathans this evening. I can't wait to hear their discussion. Jonathan Darmon, a graduate of Harvard and a former national political correspondent for Newsweek, covered three, shall we say, post-New Deal presidential campaigns, those of John Kerry, Mitt Romney, and Hillary Clinton. I'm sure he has some great stories about those dramas as well. You can explore them with him when you purchase a book at the reception upstairs following this discussion. But for tonight, we will focus on his new book, Becoming FDR. His previous book is Landslide, LBJ, and Ronald Reagan at the Dawn of the New America. Landslides, those were the days, right? Jonathan, congratulations on Becoming FDR, and we look forward to hearing about what you call the resilience and reinvention of the man who once lived here and who also made sure that this house went to Hunter College. I also, of course, want to introduce our very special interlocutor. My friend Jonathan Alter also has a Newsweek history as a former senior editor for the magazine. He now serves as a senior correspondent for NBC News, appears regularly on MSNBC, NBC, CNBC, hosts a Sirius XM show with his gifted children, does conversations on a platform called Substack, which he can also explain to us later, and is an award-winning documentary producer and director as well. He's written terrific books about American presidents and American elections, including two books on President Obama and one brilliant book on Jimmy Carter, his very best, and most relevant to this evening's discussion, The Defining Moment, FDR's 100 Days, and the Triumph of Hope. And I'm proud to say that John has appeared here at Roosevelt House several times, presenting his own works and expertly discussing the works of others. So a quick review of this evening's proceedings. We'll have the conversation between John and John for about 45 minutes. We will then take some audience questions. I importune you all to please wait for a microphone when you're recognized by Jonathan Alter, and then we will adjourn to the historic Four Freedoms room upstairs to toast our special guests. So now, please welcome Jonathan Darman in conversation with Jonathan Alter on becoming FDR.
Thanks, Harold. And thanks to everybody for coming, and those of you who are watching at home. I always get a thrill when I come into Roosevelt House because so much of both of our books took place here. And when I walk in the front door, I always remember that Roosevelt announced a good chunk of his cabinet from the front steps. And sometimes there would be people at the depths of the Depression, you know, yelling, "We're hungry," or the pressures of the world that he was inheriting, the responsibilities he was inheriting, were very present. But we're gonna talk about some of the other things that happened in this house as we get into the conversation. But I wanted to start. John, we're both Jonathans who worked at Newsweek and covered politics.
And we call each other John.
Right. You note in the introduction, I think, that you actually started out working on a different book about Roosevelt, and then you changed course. Why?
Well, first of all, I want to say it's really an honor to be here with you, John, and to be here at the Roosevelt House talking about Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt. I think anyone who's sort of smart in a karmic sense might be tempted to call it the Sarah Roosevelt House. You know, this was Sarah Delano Roosevelt was Franklin Roosevelt's mother, and this was very much her house. She died, of course, in 1941, but she was such a formidable and indomitable presence that I don't think the grave would stop her from letting us know if there was anything we say tonight that she doesn't like. So it's wonderful to be here with all of you. That's right. I didn't set out to write a book about FDR and polio. I wanted to look at FDR because I wanted to sort of get at a question that seems pretty urgent right now, which is, when the world is scary, how does a president form a bond with the American people and inspire hope? And I thought I would look at the presidency, and I didn't really think I was going to spend much time looking at polio at all. I thought I sort of knew the polio story, and that everyone else did too. But as I got into it, sort of wrestling with that question of how did FDR bring hope to the country, I understood that so much of it was rooted in his own experience getting polio at age 39 and being wrenched from what had been a pretty ordered plan for his life and having to rethink his path and really develop all these new characteristics. And I saw that sort of described from the people who knew him best. Eleanor Roosevelt talked about the years immediately following FDR's polio as the period where he was forced to reckon with the fundamental principles of living. Louis Howe, who's a big figure, was a big figure in this house, is a big figure in my book, talked about how FDR would spend hours here in this house in the months immediately following leaving the hospital after getting polio. And he talked about it as the first time where he really thought about the world from the other fellow's point of view, in Howe's words. And he said that lying there, he grew bigger by the day. And so I wanted to sort of look at that story and look at that and what we could learn from that about how it really shaped FDR's character and shaped the way that he was able to bring hope to the presidency. And I think the moment that the book really sort of revealed itself to me was looking at letters that other polio patients wrote to FDR, starting from the very first weeks after his diagnosis was announced to the public in 1921. People wrote to him because he was a famous person. He had run for president in 1920 on the Democratic ticket as this sort of vigorous, athletic young man in a hurry. So it was a big shock when it was announced that he had what was called infantile paralysis. And other polio patients wrote to him, and some of them were seeking advice, but others were offering it. And one person wrote about his own experience. He was fully paralyzed. He had been in a hospital for 7 years. And he wrote about the ways that fear and anger and shame had sort of impeded his recovery. And his advice to FDR was, Mr. Roosevelt, don't worry, whatever you do, it won't help any. And when I read those words, I see a direct line to the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
Before we get to Roosevelt being stricken, let's talk a little bit about the young Roosevelt. And you mentioned Sarah. So you make an interesting argument that she not only gave her only child great confidence, but that she also, some of it might have been, natural, but she also helped to develop a cheerfulness and an optimism. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I think FDR was famous for having this sort of eternally placid exterior. His speechwriter turned biographer Robert Sherwood talked about it as his heavily forested interior. It was really hard to get at what was really going on inside of Roosevelt's head, which is something that I struggled with writing about Roosevelt. I'm sure you did at times too.
Indeed.
I think a lot of that has its roots in his upbringing from Sarah Roosevelt. She described his childhood as this sort of wonderful idyll where he didn't really need much handling at all, in her words. And she was sort of the mistress of every aspect of his upbringing. Other women of her class in the late 19th century, they could farm out a lot of child rearing, maybe to a nanny or to a governess or to whoever else. Sarah didn't want that. She wanted to be in charge of every single aspect of her son's upbringing. And she really didn't have a lot of rules for his upbringing, but she had sort of one giant expectation, which was that he would be pleasant all the time. And I think what that creates in FDR is not just the ability to exude pleasantness, it sort of also creates the emotional intuition that he was so famous for later on. Because when you have that sort of rule hanging over you of be pleasant, you become very attuned to the first sign that you're causing any displeasure in others, and you make subtle adjustments. So I think that really has roots for FDR. But what it does, ultimately, and we'll talk about this when we get into the polio story, is it makes him in a lot of ways someone who is a lonely person because it's hard for him to express, I think, what's really going on. And that's why this moment of polio where he gets wrenched out of the plan for his life is really a rare opportunity to sort of get behind that heavily forested interior and see what's going on.
Was he a mama's boy?
Definitely. I mean, he went to Groton, as other sons of the Protestant aristocracy did in that age. But he went later, and he was still scrawny and small, and he was bullied. And it was because he hadn't really spent much time around other children. He had a much older half brother, but he had really had this childhood in Hyde Park that was ruled by this sort of extreme privilege, extreme adulation from Sarah, and extreme isolation. So he didn't, and particularly in his younger years, have like great instincts about how to get along with people. He was always sort of talking a little too loud and a little too proud of himself and moving a little too fast. And that continues all the way through his 20s, and by the time he's in his 30s and he's an established figure in national politics, he's sort of modulated that in a way that, people know how, people have a sense, he knows how to make people like him, but he hasn't really had anything that's forced him to sort of develop a deeper quality to his character that he's going to need when he encounters.
And
real
so, you know,
adversity.
he gets married to Eleanor, and President Theodore Roosevelt gives away the bride because his brother Elliot, her father, was dead by then of alcoholism. You know, they said that Teddy had to be the bride at every wedding and the corpse at every funeral. So
Yeah, and that
they
was
were
like
like-
literally true at Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt's wedding.
yeah, they were spectators basically at their own wedding. And she introduces him to some things, but she doesn't really deepen him that much in the first 15 years of their marriage, right? He's still pretty callow throughout that whole period.
Yeah, and I think a lot of that has to do with the person you just mentioned, Teddy Roosevelt. So he gets this idea at a young age when he's in college. Teddy Roosevelt is catapulted into the presidency after the assassination of William McKinley, and all of a sudden, Teddy Roosevelt is the most celebrated, famous person in the country, and Franklin Roosevelt, who still was that kid who'd been bullied at Groton, he hadn't really found a way to fit in. All of a sudden, he has the last name of the President of the United States. And I think he sees in Teddy Roosevelt sort of a model of what he can become. And in the years that follow that, he really goes about very deliberately trying to emulate Teddy's path to the presidency. He runs for the state legislature in New York. Woodrow Wilson appoints him as the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, which is the job that Teddy Roosevelt had when he really became a national figure. And Franklin does a really good sort of Teddy Roosevelt impersonation. He quickly discovers that journalists are kind of lazy and that they like you if you give them an easy story. And an easy story for them was, here's another Roosevelt in the Navy Department. Yeah. So he used the word bully a lot, and he sort of ran around and made a big impression on people. He got placed on the 1920 Democratic ticket in part because he made such a stirring impression on people, running around and leaping over rows of chairs on the convention floor. And it's really, I think, in a lot of ways, a big Teddy Roosevelt sort of ventriloquism performance.
And he had just died the year before. Teddy
and I think that's, so Teddy dies in 1919. FDR is on the Democratic ticket in 1920. FDR gets polio in 1921. And I think that's sort of really important context for understanding what it was like for FDR when this happens to him, because I think in a certain way, if you're Franklin Roosevelt and you've spent all this time trying to become the next Teddy Roosevelt dies, and that's your moment. You're the first Roosevelt in line, and that's sort of what he thought he was headed for, and in fact, he was headed for something really different.
But when the Republicans took over Congress in the 1920 election, they went really, really rough on him on a sex scandal. And, you know, it said, lay sex scandal at F.D. Roosevelt. Details unprintable on the front page of the New York Times. So
not exactly the headline you want if you see yourself as the next Teddy Roosevelt.
Right. So what was that about? And that was just before he was stricken. Right?
Yeah, I mean it was in 1920, and you're right. It came about in the aftermath of World War I. There was this concern in the Navy Department and in the Wilson administration that Newport, Rhode Island, where there was a big naval facility, had become a sort of den of sin and iniquity. And the thing that was worse that was going on there was what they called sodomy, sex, men having sex with men. It was sort of something that if you were Franklin Roosevelt and you were the number 2 person in the Navy Department, you didn't want to get too involved with, but you also didn't want to have it being something that could be laid on you. So they have this terrible scheme that gets created by this obscure, sort of obsessive figure in the Navy Department, where they actually sent out young, attractive men from the Navy to entrap other men and get them to engage in sexual acts. And when that gets revealed, that the Navy Department has been sending out, young, strapping men to have sexual contact with other men, it's not a great story. And it was all happening under FDR's aegis. His defense will be that he didn't really know exactly what was going on. But even that, I think, shows sort of the limitations in his character in the years before polio, because no matter what, it's sort of a failure of empathy. At the end of the day, he was signing these orders that were condemning these men. And if it was a failure to imagine what was actually happening to them, it shows like how I think he was in those years really more focused on his own advancement and not necessarily the condition of others.
So take us through when he contracts polio and what the aftermath was like for him.
So he gets polio in the summer of 1921. He had run as the Democratic candidate in 1920 as the vice presidential candidate, and that was not a good year for the Democrats. They lost to the Harding-Coolidge ticket by a landslide. So they came back here, and they moved into this house. And he was sort of trying to set himself up in business, but also keep his hand in politics. And there's not really a clear path for him. But he's sort of moving, trying to keep up this act of I'm the vigorous young man. And he gets polio in the summer of 1921. He really is felled by the infection, the effects of it, on a summer night in August on Campobello Island, where the Roosevelts had another home, their cottage. And at that point, it's about as bad a place as you could be if you were getting a sort of mysterious and terrifying illness, because Campobello was this isolated island off the coast of Maine, and the house didn't have electricity. The island had one phone, and he gets sort of, he's paralyzed and has a high fever. He's deathly ill, and no one really knows what's happened to him. And he goes through this long period of diagnosis, and ultimately he's given the diagnosis of infantile paralysis, polio, which in 1921 is about as terrifying a diagnosis as you can get. Polio had been around and commonly feared, particularly here in New York. In the years before, there'd been a terrible epidemic that killed thousands of people, most of them children. And people knew that it was this terrifying illness, but they didn't really know anything about, or they didn't know very much about how it was communicated, what caused it, and really what the proper way to treat it was. And they also thought that it affected people who were not like Franklin Roosevelt. A lot of people, when his diagnosis was announced in the fall of 1921, wrote to him saying, "You're the last person I would imagine to get infantile paralysis." And I think that was in part because it was a disease that was associated with children, but in part because it was a disease that was associated with the urban poor and with recent immigrants to the United States. And I think, one of the early signs of this sort of what I see as a transformation in FDR's character is that he doesn't sort of shy away from being publicly identified as someone who had polio. It would have been pretty easy for him to sort of lean into that, oh yeah, I'm the last person you'd think of as having infantile paralysis, and not really ever talk about it again, just sort of be, in the parlance of the time, an invalid. But instead, he forms this bond with other polio survivors, other polio patients, and he becomes very interested in not only his own treatment, but their treatment. And I think that shows us the beginnings of this growth in him. He sees that he can form a connection with other people, even if they come from a background that's very different from his.
But before that, and I hate to return again to the topic of sex, but I'm going to. He's kind of depressed,
Yeah.
and he buys a ramshackle boat.
Yep.
And he goes off on his boat, and 3 years earlier, Eleanor had discovered that he had had a passionate love affair with her social secretary, Lucy Mercer, and their marriage changed, and which we can talk about if people want to. But he essentially took up with his secretary, Missy LeHand, who accompanied him. I think it was 150 days. He was on the boat the first year after he was stricken. I think you used that figure, which is really a lot. of time away.
I think it was, yeah. I mean, it was definitely a lot of time. Yeah.
Oh, wait, maybe that
it's
was
150
later.
days is later in the
Oh,
1920s
that's later.
when
I'm
he's in Warm
sorry.
Springs.
That's what
but,
Warm
But
Springs.
similarly,
But
Missy
he
was
was-
there with him too.
Yeah. So, one of his sons said that he and Missy were lovers. The others weren't sure, said no. Did you come away with any sense of what happened when they were on the boat?
That's exactly right. So there's this interesting moment that happens several decades after FDR's death, where first of all it gets sort of the Lucy Mercer affair is written about, and then FDR's children at first are very upset about the idea of their parents' marriage having this sort of exposure that was not common in the 1930s. But then they all start saying that several of them write their own memoirs, and one of them says that it was definitely a sexual relationship between FDR and Missy, and one of them says that it was definitely not. My feeling is that FDR, it was not really about sex for FDR with Missy LeHand or with any of the other women with whom he had what we would call sort of romantic entanglements. In the years after polio and during the presidency. It was about this sort of flirtation and this emotional intimacy and this sort of having what Missy had these adoring eyes, and she would always laugh at his jokes, and she would take care of him. And we can talk about Eleanor, but I think one of the things that was so interesting to me in the years that I write about was seeing how Eleanor really sort of comes to not only accept that, but really depend on it, because having someone else who can play that role for Franklin Roosevelt allows her to go do the very interesting story of becoming Eleanor Roosevelt.
Right. So in that period, so when he kind of comes out of his funk and he purchases Warm Springs, how does the management of that institution and the people that he met down there change him?
So FDR goes to Warm Springs in the fall of 1924. So by that point, he'd had polio for 3 years.
To Southwest Georgia.
Yeah, that's right. And Warm Springs was this place that he had been told had this sort of miraculous power to it, that there are these waters there that come up out of the ground, and they can take people who've been paralyzed and give them the ability to walk again. And by that point, 3 years after he first took ill, FDR is in a place where he's really sort of looking for a miraculous cure, because he has not regained the ability to walk on his own unaided, and the sort of conventional thinking about polio after effects at that point was that if you haven't regained muscle function by that point, it's not coming back. He was not willing to accept that. So he went to Warm Springs looking for something, a sort of miracle for him. And I think it was a miraculous place for him, but it had nothing to do with giving him back the ability to walk. It sort of is the place that opens up this uncommon and really amazing ability to care for other people and inspire hope and foster resilience in other people. And you see it from the very first months after he makes his first visit there. He's writing letters to other polio patients saying, I really think you should go to Warm Springs, Georgia. It's this wonderful place. Let me tell you about it. There's kind people there. And very quickly he starts thinking of it as his own. He does buy it. He spends a substantial portion of his own net worth doing it, and that's really sort of stepping out of the moment, which is the roaring 20s. Other people, his friends, other people in his class are finding ways to get rich without making a lot of effort. He really puts a lot of his own capital into this place that's going to be about improving other people's lives. And I think you see him developing this sort of sense for what people need when they're in difficulty. I looked at a patient's report from there, which describes sort of X-patient when he arrived here, this muscle was this big, now it's grown to be this size. He could only walk X length, now he can walk X length on crutches. And at the bottom of the report, the person who's written the report signs his name, and it's Franklin D. Roosevelt. He was that involved with other people's care. And I think what's moving about that in a lot of ways is as he's taking pride in that improvement, he's failing to make the same improvement himself. And I think that's why Warm Springs is sort of like at the heart of what he can do in his presidency, because it's where he understands this ability that he has to help other people and to sort of encourage them toward a better place.
And he's lifting people up in a way that is almost anticipating the sort of conjuring act of his presidency. So
That's right. I think about when you say conjuring act, I think about there's a moment from the first winter after polio when he's here in the house and his son Jimmy comes home from Groton, and Jimmy writes about this in his own memoir later on. And he talks about how all the kids were sort of terrified because they'd had this father who'd been so physically present. He would wrestle with them. He was rambunctious, and they didn't really understand what had happened to him. And FDR, when the kids come into the room, FDR will pull up the blanket and he'll show them his legs, which were massively depleted, and he'll start telling them the names of all the different muscles. And he'll say, "Ooh, FDR would say, I can feel those muscles coming back." And Jimmy Roosevelt wrote, "And we believed him because he believed it." And that's, I think, what he did in the first days of his presidency, which you've written so beautifully about, John, is sort of say things in a way that has this confidence behind it that helps other people to feel that confidence as well.
I think we both think Warm Springs was a kind of almost a dress rehearsal for his presidency. But you go, very deep with great psychological insight into the way it changed him and the qualities that he learned through that experience and how they didn't only change his character, but also had a kind of a direct impact on his presidency. So what are a few of those character traits that you can draw a connection to various accomplishments?
Yeah, I think of it almost as it's a place where he learns the pragmatic necessities of hope. And a lot of it is based in his own experience and what he had felt in the first weeks and months and years after his illness. There's this focus on dignity, that someone who is paralyzed, who has lost the ability to walk, can be in a lot of situations that are quite embarrassing. And so at Warm Springs, he pays attention to the fact that there hadn't been a place for people to change. He makes really comfortable changing rooms so that if you're a paralysis patient and you're going to get into the warm water pool, you have privacy in order to change, in order to do that. And that seems like a little thing, but it's that sort of focus on dignity. He thinks about the fact that when you're looking for hope, you need detailed maps of your progress, and that means you need to be measuring your progress. So that's what I was talking about before with that medical report. It's sort of making sure that everyone at Warm Springs, there was a system to keep track of the kind of progress that they made. They need the sense of community. He ordered them to build walkways connecting all the cottages, and they created a dining hall where people could have meals together, so that you weren't just going there to get treatment for yourself. You were forming a connection with other people who had had an experience like your own. So I think those principles, when you look at the New Deal, those are all of those things, that sort of sense that you can't solve all of someone's problems right away, but you can work to restore their dignity pretty quickly. I think that's sort of at the heart of a lot of the New Deal programs, and I think a lot of that was in a lot of ways, Warm Springs was his laboratory, his testing ground for that.
There were some people who he did not pay too much attention to in Georgia in that period, in the Jim Crow South. So why did Roosevelt, who has a reputation as this great liberal, kind of ignore segregation in ways that Eleanor did not?
Right. I mean, I think this is one of these moments in the American story where it's sort of the best impulses are right next to the worst impulses. Warm Springs, which is the place that expands FDR's powers of empathy dramatically, is also the place that is the site of his greatest failure of empathy. He's going down to spend time in Georgia for, half the year in the late 1920s. And he doesn't really show any particular sense of outrage over what he's encountering in the Jim Crow South. And even worse than that, he sort of plays into it. He writes a column for a while for the local newspaper where he says these sort of gross, semi-racist things and towards Japanese American, overtly racist things. Some people might be inclined to excuse it by saying, well, lots of privileged liberals in the 1920s had not yet had enlightenment on civil rights, which is true, but the ultimate sort of argument against that, as you say, John, is Eleanor Roosevelt. The first time that she goes to Warm Springs with Franklin, they're being driven around and they're shown a nice school for poor white children. And the person who's showing them around is showing them all the wonderful things they're doing for these poor white children. And Eleanor's question is, what about the poor black children? And I think that she's far ahead of her husband on civil rights at that point, and she will be for the rest of his life. And it's because in a lot of ways, Franklin Roosevelt, even in these years where his character is expanding, and he's thinking of others more and more, he's also thinking about his return to politics in a segregation era Democratic Party where a New Yorker who wants to be a national candidate needs the support of the solid South. And he views his time in Georgia as a way to make a connection with Southern politicians, and the last thing he wants to do is rock the boat on race. And it's a really uncomfortable part of FDR's legacy, but it's something we have to think about when we look at these years.
But on the positive side, you say that he became more serious, focused, empathetic, patient, which I think is interesting. Patients have to be patient. And he hadn't had much before that. And also, he showed no anxiety, which for all of Eleanor's often quite tart criticism of her husband, she was consistently impressed by the fact that he never seemed to have any trouble sleeping, like he did during World War II.
Yeah, I think she had a line that was, he had this amazing ability to make a decision and then draw a curtain and go to sleep, which I would love to have that ability. But I think that comes out of this experience too, because he gets polio and he understands that it's going to be a hard path back to walking again, and he wants to sort of find as many different kinds of advice as he can get about the way to do it, the kind of rehabilitative scheme he should pursue. And he researches these things, and then he commits himself to them, and he knows at that point that it's going to be months or even years before he understands if they work. So that sort of forces him to develop that patience and that sense of things are out of his control, as much as he might try to organize events otherwise.
But he tried to control the image of his polio. He didn't hide it at the beginning, but when he re-entered politics, he made sure that there were no photographs of him in a wheelchair, which he used all day. And how did he create the impression of walking? What was that about?
It's an interesting sort of mix in this period, because I think, and this was one of the things that was surprising to me working on this, because I think we all think about this with the FDR presidency, the lengths that he went to keep the country from focusing on him, as you say, in a wheelchair, and the sort of code of silence that existed in the press. If you were someone who was reading the newspaper in the 1920s and you were familiar with Franklin Roosevelt, you very much knew that he had had infantile paralysis. You might have even seen big newspaper stories about him describing his regime at Warm Springs with these pictures that showed just how much his body had been transformed by the illness. And when he makes his eventual return to politics in the late 1920s, running for governor of New York, the polio story is sort of part of the narrative. He is someone who has come back from this horrible experience, and that's something that people can grab onto. And what we would say today, it gives him it humanizes him. And that's true when he's running for president in 1932 as well. It also gets talked about a lot by his rivals. in these sort of coded or not so coded ways. Al Smith, who's a contender for the presidency in 1932, talks about him as Al Smith's sort of surrogates describe FDR as a weakling. And I think that's the thing that was really driving FDR as he made his return to politics, was people could know that he had a disability, but they couldn't ever think about him as weak. And I think this is another area where, again, the other polio patients really had it right in a lot of ways. I read an essay that a Warm Springs patient wrote in the early days of the FDR presidency about this conversation about FDR's disability and what in his words, able-bodied people thought of it. And that patient wrote, "Perhaps they failed to see that the paralysis which has made us weaker animals has also made us stronger men." And I think that's what I believe, having looked at this, and I think that other people at the time didn't see it, but the other polio patients did.
I was very interested that you described some lessons that he, in some ways, mislearned in his presidency. For instance, he was always talking about throwing away the crutches, and that he didn't have to use crutches anymore. That this was, and in 1937, he suddenly thinks old Doc Roosevelt, which he called himself, suddenly thinks that the patient, the American economy is up and walking around, and they can throw away the crutches. So
they literally say that.
So he cuts the budget by like 40%.
Right.
And I just hadn't made the connect. And then, of course, he immediately reverses that and continues on with more New Deal programs. But he had this moment where he kind of thought that in the same way certain patients were, if not cured, they were dramatically improved at Warm Springs. And he was certainly conveying that that's what had happened with him, that the American economy could walk on its own. And that turned out not to be true.
It's hope, false hope. And FDR constantly, I think you see him in the 1920s as he's pursuing his rehabilitation. He has these moments where he just sort of gets tired of the regime. And it's frustrating to his doctors, it's frustrating to Eleanor. He doesn't want to do it because he's used to this sort of paradigm of, okay, there should be just dramatic improvement. In a lot of ways that impedes any improvement that he was going to make. And I did see the same thing, in the late 30s where there's this sort of weird reversal of everything he's been doing, of saying, okay, as we're gonna pull the crutches away. And it's the same thing. It's this sort of false hope based on fantasy and not based on reality. And I think the greater successes of his presidency were sort of rooted in the lesson that he had gotten from the earliest days of his illness, of that hope needs to be grounded in something real or it doesn't last.
Then in the early 40s, he says Dr. New Deal has become Dr. Win the War. So he's going to apply his talents to another challenge. Would love to hear your questions. We have microphones. Please don't ask your question until somebody has approached you with the mic, or the C-SPAN audience will not hear it. So in the back, why don't we start right there?
Two things about Warm Springs. Was it men only? And having purchased it and made a communal dining room and all of that, how long did he own it, and whatever happened to it? Did it survive his passing?
It did. Warm Springs, it sort of grew beyond him as when he became president. He stopped being involved in the day-to-day life of patients because obviously he was running the country, but he had the little White House, which was sort of adjacent to Warm Springs, in Warm Springs, Georgia. And he was, I think, in a lot of ways, the sort of guiding presence at Warm Springs. He would spend Thanksgiving there every year. At the end of my book, I described sort of this very moving scene at Thanksgiving in 1941, a week before Pearl Harbor, where he sort of knows what's coming. He doesn't know that the attack is coming, but he knows that that the world is in a dark place, and I think he really gains sustenance from being with the other patients at Warm Springs, and it survived as a place where people could seek treatment beyond his death, and there was not just men, it was women as well, and children, and yeah.
And when did it close down, if it ever closed down?
There still is a Georgia Warm Springs Rehabilitation Center, and there are people there who receive rehabilitative care today.
It's very much worth a visit if you're
It
in
is,
Georgia.
yeah.
It's right on the way to Plains if you want to go. Dick Ravitch. Hang on one second, Dick, until she gets down there with the mic. There you go.
When did he first think about running for president?
So I think he starts thinking about it when he is a sophomore in college. There are friends of his who say that that's the moment
No,
that he.
obviously when he ran for vice president, but after he had polio and
Yeah, well, thank you. That's a great point we haven't touched on. So it's a really important part of his recovery in a lot of ways. He comes back. He comes out of the hospital in the fall of 1921, and he's here. And his chief political advisor is Louis Howe, and a lot of political advisors, when they have Louis Howe had gotten in with Franklin Roosevelt early. He'd spotted him as a coming man. And a lot of political advisors, when the candidate that they've bet on gets a disability that's going to take them out of the action for a while, might look for another place to go. Louis Howe moved in here to be part of every aspect of FDR's life.
And he pushed Anna out of her bedroom.
Yes, there's lots of.
Was that the third floor? It was like.
She was she was the other third floor bedroom, and there's this great drama in the family that Anna, I think, is in a lot of ways working out her discomfort in the sort of change in her parents' marriage, because it's hard for the Roosevelt kids in a lot of ways. One of the realities of FDR's polio is that this divide between his private life and his public life, which had always existed before, goes away, because he can't go to places, so the public world has to come to him. And if you're his child, that's hard, because the sort of private realm which has been yours, where you have a unique claim on Franklin Roosevelt, disappears. And that's hard. But to get back to the sort of idea of running for president, Louis Howe realizes that if FDR is going to get better, if he's going to make improvement, he needs to believe that there's something better ahead of him. He hears that from the doctors, and so he goes. And everyone else around FDR at this period is saying, why don't you retire to Hyde Park, live a comfortable life as a country squire? And Louis Howe goes to FDR and he says, I not only believe that you're going to return to politics, I believe you're going to be the president of the United States, and I have a detailed plan for how it's going to happen. And FDR's response is, when do we start?
But actually, didn't Howe want it to begin later? He didn't want him to run for governor until like 32 or something.
They were 4 years
32.
off. I think Howe's plan was that he was going to run for governor in 32 and for president in 1936. And you know this well, John, in politics, you sort of go when your moment happens. And that, for FDR, that came in the autumn of 1928, when Al Smith was pressuring him to run as the Democratic candidate for governor that year. And it's, I think, in a lot of ways, a very poignant moment, because up to that point, FDR believed, against medical evidence, I should say, that he was going to regain the ability to walk, that if he could just have a little more time away from politics, spending time at Warm Springs, that he could regain the ability to walk unaided. So in his mind, when he gives in to Al Smith's entreaties, he knows that returning to politics is going to make that impossible. So he's really choosing his political future in his mind over ever walking again.
Yeah.
I'm Michael Myers. I'm the president of the New York Civil Rights Coalition.
Michael.
My question is to you about Eleanor Roosevelt. what took so long to wake him up about her lesbianism? Did he know? When did he know it? And did it matter? Secondly, what took him so long to wake up to Eleanor Roosevelt's hounding him about race? I mean, why was he so beloved by blacks when the military, one of his greatest accomplishments, was segregated? I mean, why did blacks love him so?
Yeah, there's a lot, several very good questions there.
Yeah.
First of all, about Eleanor, I mean, she's a huge part of my book, because in a lot of ways, her transformation in these years is even more dramatic than her husband Franklin's. So in the years before polio, she was sort of, defeated after the Lucy Mercer affair, humiliated, and she's lacking a sense of purpose. When he runs for vice president in 1920, a reporter comes to Eleanor and asks her what she thinks about women's suffrage. And which is, a big issue in 1920. It was the first year that women had the right to vote nationally. And Eleanor's response is, I don't have a strong feeling either way. Personally, I'm content with my husband and my children. Eleanor Roosevelt saying that, and within, just a few years' time, she's not only going to have an opinion about women's suffrage, she's for it, she's going to be one of the most influential and powerful and ruthless women in American politics. And she does, in the 1920s, develop her own political agenda and her own political power base, which are to the left of her husband. And you see the beginnings there of this tension between them, where Eleanor is sort of pushing him in a lot of ways to be more progressive. And in the Roosevelt presidency, that'll play out on race a lot. Frustrated with the sort of cabal of Southerners that's around him, that's keeping him from being enlightened on race. And there's this tension, between them where she pushes him, but she doesn't really go public with too many of her disagreements because she believes in his broader project. And if you're gonna, the conversation about FDR and race and what the FDR presidency achieved on race is a very rich one. It's beyond the purview of my book, but it's it's a very, very fair critique that at a time when other people were gaining enlightenment on race in the Democratic Party and understanding that the coalition needed to change, FDR was not leading that cause.
Ira Katznelson.
Happy to.
Yeah, I was just, before we leave the race issue, a Columbia professor named Ira Katznelson has written a good book on this, and there were, in order to get Social Security through, they had to eliminate any occupations that were held by African Americans. That later changed, but he made a series of political compromises. Anyway, go ahead.
On her relationships with women, there is. Yeah, I mean, she's. I agree with you. So there's this quality in their marriage in the years before polio, which I think makes her unhappy. Which is this: there's always a distance with Franklin. There's a part of him that she can't share, and a part of her that he doesn't really care about. After polio, when she's pursuing her own independent life, that becomes a great virtue for her. She has a husband who is okay with her going off and leading her own life in a lot of ways. That means being a public figure and having, all these causes that she's very involved in. And it also means having relationships, starting in the early 1920s, with other women, many of whom are lesbians, that are these sort of tight, intimate friendships that a lot of people around the Roosevelts are not comfortable with. They say, who are these friends of Eleanor's, But FDR sort of rolls with it. He's fine with it, and he invites them, into his own orbit. And even, by the time that he is running for president, when Eleanor develops what I think is indisputably a romantic and sexual tie with Lorena Hickok, that was all happening on FDR's campaign. And he was not a guy that missed things. He was a guy that was comfortable not noticing things and not making a big deal of things if it wasn't to his advantage. But I think he understood that he and Eleanor had worked out this complex new union that was not going to be based in sort of a conventional marital union, but it was going to be based in something broader, which is their sort of mission to ease other people's suffering.
He was a deeply tolerant and open-minded man. Yes. There, and we'll do two right in the middle.
Hi. In your research, did you come across the speculation that Roosevelt contracted polio by attending an all-day, it was a Boy Scout jamboree upstate New York, where the water was supposed to be contaminated? What bothers me, disturbs me, is that the campgrounds, there had been complaints about this for quite some time before Roosevelt attended this jamboree. He was there all day, he was drinking the water, he was eating the food where water was used to cook. And that's been speculation. Did you come across that at all?
Yeah, I think we don't know exactly, but the best thinking is that he did contract. He came into contact with the virus when he was at that Boy Scout retreat, there's a moment I think after he takes ill and he's stuck on Campobello, and it's before he's been diagnosed, and the sort of people around him are trying to keep him occupied. And Grace Howe, Louis Howe's wife, is reading him the newspaper, and she reads to him about a infantile paralysis outbreak in upstate New York. And again, FDR has not yet been told by anyone that he has polio. And he says, Grace, could you read that article again? And that's probably the moment that he knew, or he started to have a good sense of what exactly it was that had happened to him. So yeah, I think that is generally believed to be the moment where he got it. But people in 1921 really didn't have a good sense of how polio was contracted. They talked about it. It's in a lot of ways sort of like the early months of the pandemic, when we were all washing our groceries, it was like that for decades. There was this idea that it was communicated by insects, so there was a big campaign to kill all the flies. And they talked about, it was associated with dirt, so there were big projects to clean up, remove dirt from slums. People didn't understand that the ways in which it was communicated through water and that it was swallowed. They thought it was primarily communicated through coughing. So it's there's a lot of things that could have been done differently around the time of FDR's infection, but a lot of it really was cloaked in a vast amount of ignorance.
If you could pass the mic right across the aisle. Oh, I'm sorry. There you go. Thank you.
I'm not an expert on FDR, but I do believe when we read the histories of these people, I think with a perspective to the future. So the polio suffering and the resilience and the struggle, if it made him, are we lacking somehow those qualities in the modern presidents? For instance, back home in India, we used to elect prime ministers, those who participated in the freedom struggle, who sacrificed things for the people. But now it is all money. So what is happening, the FDR legacy now, when we're going to have a new deal?
Yeah, it's a great question, and something that I was really thinking about a lot when I was working on this book. I was working on this during the pandemic, during the 2020 election, during the aftermath of the 2020 election, and there would be certain days where I would look to FDR's life, FDR's speeches in the 1930s for some kind of consolation, and I would come back to a line he said in a speech that John knows well, accepting the Democratic nomination in 1932, in the depths of the Depression. And he talked about, there's a line in there where he says, out of every crisis, mankind rises with some share of greater knowledge, of higher decency, and of purer purpose. And I would read those words, after January 6th, and I'd say, gosh, I hope that's true. Because it's hard sometimes to see, we have the crisis, but it's hard to see where the greater knowledge is and where the purer purpose is. But then you think about FDR saying that in 1932, that's a moment of, in a lot of ways, even greater peril for the Republic. And he said those words and people believed him. And again, people believed him because he believed it, and he believed it because he had lived it in his own life. And so, a big thing that I've taken away from this is thinking about how we should evaluate politicians when they talk about hope. Hope is a word that gets thrown around a lot in our politics. But I think a question that we really should ask is, when did that politician need hope in their own life, and what did they learn from that?
Certainly Joe Biden has been in some ways ennobled by his own suffering. Yes, back there. This is our last question.
This is a question from a person joining us virtually on Zoom. Pamela Wolfson asks, well, first she admits it's an impossible question perhaps, but what is your opinion as to whether FDR would have been as successful a president if he had not had polio?
I do not think that is an impossible question. I think that FDR might have, and I'd be interested what you think about this, John, but I think FDR might have someday been able, if the cards had been right, to get to the presidency, but he wouldn't have been a great president. It's only this experience of having to face suffering and learn from suffering that gives him the insight into what other people's suffering is like. And that, he made a lot of good decisions as president. He made some bad ones too, but ultimately he was one of the most successful presidents we ever had, leading this country through the Depression and World War II, because he was able to understand what people need when the world is really terrifying. And I think that's what makes this story, inspiring and also useful to us now.
I completely agree. I think with that, we have to bring this to a close. Thanks so much for listening.